We're back here again on a Thursday with Think and Link, Brand New World. And we're going to have a wonderful conversation today that we are beyond excited about. We have Ishveen and Julia. We're going to talk sports. We're going to talk racing. We're going to review some of the stuff we just talked about in the pre-conversation because that was very interesting already. We're going to have to go back to that. But before we do all of that, I want to make sure that you know the team that sponsors this, that puts this on, that does this for our larger community of friends that are looking for moments of inspiration. It's Capsule. Our worldwide headquarters are here in Minneapolis, and we put on this event to hopefully spread some inspiration. And we are a special projects firm here in Minneapolis, and we do a lot of work for brands like Tyson Foods, Cheerleader, what other ones, Kelly? Arc'teryx, Osprey, a variety of others. Interesting. Hydro Flask is a great one. Yes. I am going to hand it over to our guests to introduce themselves. We are in a new format. We've moved to that other word that I can't even say out loud when it's recording. And so as people join, definitely put your questions in the chat for our guests as it happens. I'm happy to see those and put those into the conversation where possible. And we're going to have an interesting 1 hour conversation that I'm sure will go by in a heck of a hurry. So let's start with Julia with a little bit on your background and how you got to this moment in time.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Julia Landauer, and I'm a two-time champion race car driver from New York City. I started in go-karts. I moved up to racing cars. I won my first championship when I was 14 in the Skip Barber Racing Series. Kept climbing the minor leagues of racing and NASCAR. And then I also felt it very important to go to school. And I went to Stanford, where I got a Bachelor of Science degree in Science, Technology, and Society, which allowed me to dabble in a lot of different subjects. While I was at school, I applied for and got onto the show Survivor, season 26. Whole different experience that was super cool and taught me a lot about my lack of self-awareness. But then after I graduated, I moved to North Carolina, which is Charlotte is basically the heart of NASCAR. And I raced in a local NASCAR series where I won another championship, continued climbing the ranks, have raced in the Canadian NASCAR series. And then in 2020, I was able to make it over to Europe, where I lived for 3 months in France, racing in the European NASCAR series, where I finished 5th overall, which was the highest for an American ever, which was super cool. And then this year, we're kind of piecemealing a lot of races together and then preparing for next year. So I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful. That's amazing.
Yes.
Ishveen, a little background would be great.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for having me here. So Ishveen Anand, grew up in England, was a student athlete all my life, not to Julia's level, but I suppose sports kind of made me who I was. Graduated from Oxford, where I read economics and management, was a management consultant for a couple of years, and then realized my heartstrings were really pulling me back into the sports world. So thought, if I'm going to do one crazy thing, why not do two? And moved to India to become a sports agent. So back in 2009, fell in love with sponsorship as a form of marketing, but thought the whole process was just really inefficient. And so fast forward a few years, had this, I suppose, eureka moment of why is it not an Airbnb for our industry? And so very naively went out to create it, but we are now the largest marketplace connecting brands to athletes globally. Mostly our focus is on the US, so NFL is our biggest sport, NBA, and then so on. And it's been a fun journey, yeah.
Amazing.
Great.
Wonderful.
So excited to have you here. It's no mistake that we paired Julia, athlete, and you're both athletes, obviously in your own right, and Ishveen in sponsorship. And I'm going to jump right in if we can, because I'm really excited about the topics we want to cover today, some of which we've spoken about in previous conversations. But I want to start with the democratization of sponsorship and connecting brands and athletes, and want to hear both of your perspectives because I'm sure they're unique and they're obviously in their own right. If Ishveen, you could start, you obviously gave us some background on open sponsorship and why the marketplace and how we're sort of leveling the playing field, but really honing in on why an athlete and a brand should connect. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it's evolved? Certainly digitization of, but Give us your thoughts, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, when I first started open sponsorship, my background had been, I'd done athlete stuff, but I'd also done like team, federation, league deals. And so I was pretty agnostic to what kind of sponsorship we do. But when we launched, the market was really telling us that athletes was like the need. And I'd say a couple of things there. One, the rise of influencer marketing. When you think about influencer marketing, literally overnight in the last decade, it's become a multi-billion-dollar industry, but it definitely skews very like beauty and fashion, kind of blogger-esque. Yet when you think about who's the original influencer, like Michael Jordan or Muhammad Ali or whoever it may be, and so it was interesting that you have this whole kind of influencer marketing movement, but athletes who I would say are the original influencer weren't really being included in that. And mostly because the agents or the mindset in sports was long-term deals, must-have photo shoots and appearances and all the bells and whistles. But influencer marketing is in this new age of marketing is very similar to digital content, all of those, where you A/B test, you do one-offs, you do short-term, you see what works, then you double down. And so by kind of being able to build a platform and a business around allowing brands to essentially leverage athletes, but at scale, not for multi-year commitments, that's kind of really what gave rise to our success.
It's impressive. I mean, again, it was an archaic system, right, that you saw, and extremely high barriers to entry. And so you found this. It's amazing what you've done. I'm geeking out on the platform right now, so I'm excited to learn more. Julia, can you share your thoughts on the athlete side in terms of how you've connected with brands and what you've found over the last couple of years that has changed, or 5 years or so?
Yeah. So, and with racing, it's a little different than other bat and ball sports because racing has such a high financial barrier to entry anyway. Like it's just, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So I think that kind of team getting on the track sponsorship is a somewhat separate issue because they are extremely high dollar amounts. There are various ways you have to provide ROI and everything. But from the athlete side, I think that, everything from influencer marketing from a digital media perspective to kind of more traditional or at least more analog activation are still very cool. And I think to Ishveen's point that there are ways to kind of take control of that. And so, some of the things that I've really liked is just finding brands that have similar missions, and maybe the activation is really creating content. Maybe it's storytelling. I do a lot of motivational speaking, and while that's not sponsorship in a traditional term, it's partnership. It's coming together to provide value to an organization. And I think that there's just, there are no real rules anymore. Like if you're able to provide value as an athlete, as an influencer, whatever it is, however you creatively bring that to the table, if it's valuable to someone, they will compensate you for it. And I think that that's really cool. And the idea that you ask questions, you ask if they want to do this, you figure out where you can find those synergies, whether it is, again, kind of more social media focused or away from that.
That's great. So the transparency actually leads to more authentic relationships. It's not just, to your point, Julia, what used to be advertising, and there was a connection that didn't seem like it fit quite well, or as it should. And it seems like that's certainly, we're moving away from that. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts around that piece. Aaron, you got a question?
Yeah, that is. I hadn't really thought, Ishveen, until you talked about it that way. The fact that you're changing such an old industry that was done in an old advertising way. That's really fascinating. I mean, the fact that it's how social is done and how, athletes are their own brand, and which has kind of been known, but the way it's being done now is different. And that's just really intriguing how you've thought about that. So just sports in general, obviously a great leveler. We've got the Olympics coming up very soon, whatever, is it like next week, Tuesday or something? It's very close. Hopefully that they actually are going to happen and they don't get canceled due to COVID, but which would be horrifying. But the fact that they are an incredible leveler, but also heavily engaged in society, and there's a lot of social issues that come out, and there's the interplay between those and athletes. give me your perspective on that. What do you think as far as involvement in causes, elevating important issues? Julia, can you start with that and give me a perspective on if you should be and how you should be involved in that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a more dynamic issue than I think people think about right away. And, from my experience within racing and what I've heard from, friends who are racing or people who have these high level partnerships and sponsorships, you represent a whole lot of people. And so I think open discussion should be had, but I also really believe that, if you feel strongly about something, it is important to speak up, and representation is important. And I think it can make athletes, I think, seem more relatable, and it can also, on the flip side, create enemies. And I think that that's just a risk you take when you're a public figure anyway. You can say things that are completely well-intentioned and then they get switched around. And so I think it's a really incredible platform. I also respect that not every personality is kind of made up to kind of have that more public voice about more pressing issues. I think that comes down to the individual, but I think that it would be a shame to have worked hard to build up a platform to be able to have this kind of influence and then not use it for the causes that you feel are important. But understanding that, like, you might create some issues with people, and that's a personal risk assessment that you have to make. But I think it comes down to what the athlete's comfortable with, and I think that these discussions are important because we don't have equality across the board, we don't have fairness everywhere. So I'm all for it.
That's great.
Thanks.
Ishveen, what are you thinking on that subject?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. We've definitely seen, obviously we come at it from the sponsorship side. We have run campaigns around, hey, NFL season starting back up, and inevitably there are a couple of marketing managers, brands, people who will respond being like, we don't want to support, guys who kneel, or like, we have family members, and it can be polarizing. But I think in today's time, it's just so important that everyone has a voice. Everyone, right? Whether it's like, by gender, by age, by, whatever your background or following, I think everyone has a voice. And I think that's the same for athletes. And I love the fact that, like, if you want to be vocal about it, then great. And, the Kaepernick Nike deal shows that maybe you'll even get rewarded for it, right? Like, there is potentially, when I think about branding, there are brands who want to support that, and then there are brands who want to stay away from that. But I think it's so important to just be able to have a voice, and you're so visible, and you are, again, going back to that word of influence, you are so visible, and you influence so many people that if you believe in something and you put it out there, you can literally create more change than you realize. And I think that's pretty powerful.
And I think piggybacking off of that, like, one of the really cool things that's kind of a double-edged sword about social media is that if athletes or public figures are having these discussions, you then create that much more discussion, and you can get into this really cool dialogue across different platforms, and hopefully like help open eyes and everything. And I think that shouldn't be underestimated in terms of its power.
Yeah, there's actually there was an article that came across my desk about a Premier League footballer, Marcus Rashford, and someone was saying how much money he's made in endorsements, and he does a lot to give back. And he wrote this series of tweets that was like, hey, I've made this much money from this brand, and that has helped to feed school children. I made this much money from this brand, and this has helped to put, work towards homelessness. And I thought that was really interesting, because not that he does have to justify, like, he is most welcome to take his sponsorship dollars and keep it for himself. But at the end of the day, like, I thought it was just a really interesting way to show this idea that, like, this is a guy who has causes, he creates a stand, then brands back him, and then he's using that. I just thought, what a beautiful symbiotic relationship there.
Yeah. Interesting as far as the transparency of his funds, of where his stuff go. Like, he shows you, like, even if he takes it from what some may perceive to be a brand that's not good, but yet he uses it for good. It's
yeah, Robin Hood. There you are.
Right. Another form of an athlete, right? That's great. Kelly, do you have a question?
Yeah, and I actually, one more thing on this in the same vein, because I go back to Ishveen, to this transparency. When you're connecting brands with athletes, that shared values, it's known up front. So elevating or using your personal brand to elevate a cause or a social issue and drawing attention to that, I would imagine, again, that removes the barriers of, we didn't expect that athlete to be so vocal about this particular, because you know it up front. So I would imagine that too has come into play.
Actually, it's interesting what Julia was saying about like the authentic fit. So one of the things that we did very early on in our platform was really look at like this idea of like matching and authenticity. And of course, you don't put everything on social media, but the chances are that, you know, if you have a dog and you're a massive dog lover, you probably post pictures of your dog, or you talk about your pets or whatever else. And we've built like AI to like Google image recognition and all of this stuff. And so, and the same thing for causes, right? Like, do you talk about LGBT? Do you talk about equality, diversity, or whatever else? And so we've got things within our platform where you can search for keywords. And I think what's great about that is it's not just saying like, as an athlete, yes, I believe in this, but it's actually saying, okay, but have you talked about it? What was the context? How did your fan base respond? So I think, and to your point, like there's a lot of ways now using data that you can steer clear or go towards. And it is very authentic, because the point being is, if they've never posted something on social about X topic, then let's not start today with a brand, but let's pick people who are, you know, who are advocates for this.
Right. Great. No, thank you. I do have another question really quickly. I'm going to piggyback and actually shift gears. You're both entrepreneurs, right? So I would love to chat about entrepreneurship. We had a previous conversation about both of your backgrounds in sports and the confidence and resiliency that comes with growing up, that you wouldn't know any different moving into a career as a woman, certainly in sports. And, you know, we're trying to move away from even suggesting a female CEO or a female, it's just you're a CEO. You're an athlete, you're not a female athlete, right? But I want to talk about, I'd love your perspectives on, you know, what role did sports play for you in building and instilling some skills that we see are really critical for would-be entrepreneurs? Would just love to hear some thoughts that you both have about that. Julie, you want to start?
Sure. So I think sports are so important and one of the key things is that I think throughout history, and it's only changing recently, like girls are so rarely encouraged to be proud of winning and to want to be the best and to want to be competitive. And the reality is that you have to have some of that to be successful, you know, in life. And I really love sports as an arena where your one goal is to obliterate the competition and be the best and, you know, utilize communication and teamwork and confidence and, you know, picking yourself back up, because like girls are protected from a lot of that. And there's a study that I came across when I was at school where researchers asked mothers to set a ramp however steep they thought their toddler could climb up. And mothers tend to set the ramp steeper for boys than they do for girls. So from toddlerhood, you know, in general, you know, we push boys to find their limits, to challenge themselves, to learn how to fall down and get back up. And then we don't do that for girls. And that has, I think, really bad consequences later in life. So the fact that you can use sports to kind of counter that is super cool. And one thing that I realized that I've only thought about recently is that when I broke into racing cars, I was a 14-year-old child. Like I was a kid, my parents were with me, like they were always around. And I realized that I think the instructors and competitors kind of saw me as that child who's a good racer, and I was oblivious to any kind of gender bias. And I don't think it was relevant because I was so young. And so I realized that that kind of set the standard for what I expected moving forward, which I think is a fairly lucky position to be in, that I just expected that people would respect me for my racing abilities. And I realized that not a lot of girls get that. Girls and women are underestimated a whole lot and like have to deal with this. So I think, long story short, that sports are just incredible for so many different skills. And I highly recommend that people try to get girls into sports, even if it's just on an amateur for fun level. Like you don't have to take it to a professional level.
Right. And it's never too late to start, right?
Oh.
For those of us on the call who are, yeah, exactly. Thank you, Julia. Ishveen.
Yeah, I mean, I echo like so many great points there. So all of that, I would say that last point, a few things when I think back about playing sports and what it does for me is that bit about you're only judged based on your performance. I think that's so huge because I always say that I'll enter a conference room and they'll usually think that the guy I'm with is the CEO, or they'll like be expecting a man or whatever else, but you're basically judged on merit, right? Once you're in the room. And I think it's about you not seeing the difference between everyone else. And I think that's so huge in sports. Like I played a lot of team sports growing up. And so when you're on the court, on the field of play or whatever else, like you don't like, there's no socioeconomic background, there's no like there's no I played a lot of girl sports, but there's no kind of oh, you're bigger than me or you're small. It's based on like your own performance, right, and what you bring. And the same thing, I was captain of multiple sports, partly because of performance, but partly because I was able to rally people around me and whatever else. And so I think there's just something so beautiful about playing sports, which teaches you that it's up to you to create your path and you will be rewarded for it. And I think it's very similar in entrepreneurship, which is like you are your own worst enemy, but you're also your own best friend. Like you create your path and you just have to like go out there and, open doors for yourself and whatever else to the point that people recognize you. So absolutely, I think sports is so important for everyone to play, the winning and the losing and everything else it brings for you.
And I think piggybacking off of that, I liked what you were saying about how you can be your own worst enemy or biggest cheerleader, because I think that's such a big part of sports and entrepreneurship is obviously you have coaches, you have mentors, but you have to, inspire yourself to be self-aware. You have to understand and dig deep and understand like where your strengths are, what you need help on, what you need to outsource versus what you keep in-house. And I think that awareness and that hunger to try to optimize everything that you can is relevant to both and becomes really crucial, especially as you find challenges and as things aren't going well, and how you pick yourself up and get out of lulls and reset. And the skills are just, they parallel so nicely, and it's incredible what skills transfer over.
I would actually say, and on that, when you talked to Kelly about it's never too late, I'd say, so I've recently picked up quite a few different sports and so I'm playing a lot of tennis, and I'm thinking like, every time I play with a friend who's better than me, I'm like, okay, give me coaching lessons. And I think there's something about sports where you're always trying to like improve, self-improve. It's like built into your DNA. Like even when I go swimming, if someone's faster swimmer than me as a friend, I'm like, tell me about your breaststroke. Like, how do you go so fast? And so I would say like everyone should nurture that in whatever they're doing, some skill set, because being coachable your whole life is, I mean, it's everything, right? In your career, if you're more coachable, you're going to perform better. And that could be being coached by junior management, like people below you, your peers, or above you. And so I think this like idea that you're always learning and you always want to improve, I presume comes from the sports side for me anyway.
Yeah, and also needing to be creative in how you do that training. So like I work with a motorsport specific trainer, and some of the stuff we do is so weird and out of the box, and it's so helpful. Like I'll be cycling on a stationary bike with strobe goggles, so they're flashing, so it limits my visual input, and having to catch balls, because if you're in a car and you have a windshield, it could get obstructed, it could be raining, I mean, all this kind of stuff. And you like really pushing yourself to get creative in how you can train or prep or practice to optimize performance, whether it's from like a business side or a sports side, whatever it is. It's such an advantage. And I think that's where entrepreneurship also, you see the successful ones are where they find those unique ways to approach a problem, obviously, and getting that in sports, whether it's amateur or professional, is helpful and just so good for you.
Yes, I love it. So inspiring. No, it is that self-motivation. Where do you find it? And sports can help you, pushes you out of your comfort zone. How do I continue to move forward? That's great. Thank you both. I knew you'd have great responses to that question. So
I know. It was so good. That was amazing. Yeah, the ramp study that's a little bit horrifying, but we know that these things are built in. As a father of a daughter, it's it, you know, these are biases that we have as human beings, and you're trying not to, you know, have them come onto your kids or, you know, spill over into your children. And you know that then that stuff happens and it shows up and go, oh, I forgot about that happened, right? I can imagine all the moms who put the ramps lower for their daughters, like, really I did that. I would imagine they wouldn't want to. Anyway, and the coachable thing, oh my gosh, that is entrepreneurship. And it's, you know, how coachable are you as an entrepreneur and as an athlete? That was really good. Shifting gears a little bit, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but we've been through this thing called a pandemic. And it's a global event that we all have experienced in a variety of different ways. There's Julia's mason jar, which we've already talked about. Classic. That's a little southern there, or I don't know, a little rural maybe. And that was good. Anyway, I would like you to give us some perspective on what you've seen through this, because part of our conversations are seeing the world through your lenses and what you've seen. Because it is a global event, but it's a human individual event, and there's been so many nuances about it that we've heard through our conversation. So, Julie, you want to start us off with?
I was going to let Ishveen take that one first.
Okay, we can pass it to Ishveen. Give her the first. What has inspired you? What have you seen? What has intrigued you about how we've been getting through this?
I think the adaptability of us as humans, the human race, the workforce, is probably what like stuns me the most. Where, you know, if 3 years ago someone had said, in a year's time, for a year and a half, you will not see anyone, you will not get on a flight, your office will be shut down. Like we would never have believed it. We would have all like literally gone into like Armageddon or something. I don't know. But the point being is, it came. We adapted, we survived, mostly, which is really sad. Obviously, that's the worst part of it. Many businesses thrived. The acceleration of technological innovation, like, you know, how many times were we like video calling our friends and family before? Now that's to stay, and it's such a beautiful thing. You know, so I think that was. I think the adaptability was huge. For us as a business, the adaptability meant we went remote. And I was the kind of person who, like, first one in, last one out of the office, like never did remote a day of my life. You know, just couldn't do it. And then suddenly I'm like, oh, this is quite liberating, and this works, and it's different. And it's definitely, I think it's so much easier on people with kids. Well, I mean, obviously pandemic was hard, but coming out of that, the flexibility, and I think there's something beautiful about that like maybe like when you think about disabled folks, and maybe they're more able to get jobs if it's remote, whereas they couldn't if Manhattan and the office is there. So I think there's like some sort of equality that's come in. For us personally, we've signed some of our biggest clients that we've ever had in the last year. And I do put it down to the fact that, like, you know, whether it's Levi's or Walmart or whoever, if they are not having to be wined and dined, or they can't be wined and dined by the agency, and they're basically just going off merit and a phone call and who's got the best product, then we're all is equal footing, and we win. So it's been interesting for me to think about, okay, why did that happen? And, you know, as a lean team, we can't always fly to a meeting, or we don't even get the opportunity to be in that boardroom. But now it's like, sure, I'll give you an hour of your time, my time, and then suddenly doors open up. So lots of positives on the adaptability and work front. Of course, like it's definitely a hard year in terms of like marketing budgets and sports and you know, obviously the medical side of things as well.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that, like I think from the actual sports side, it was super interesting because racing was one of the first sports to come back, because it is a fairly individual sport, and they were able to have it so that, you know, they had protocols in place and the drivers just went straight to their cars. And I thought that was very cool, but it was an interesting dynamic because sponsorships were effective, and companies that had these obligations to teams, to drivers, you know, some of them couldn't meet them because of just this huge drop. So the creativity to try to provide value in other ways, especially when racing wasn't on TV, was interesting. But I think one of the biggest things, like, sports is a community that brings so many passionate people together. And I think one of the biggest downsides was that, like, we didn't have fans for any of our racing. And I think that you definitely felt the difference, and then not being able to have the hustle and bustle of the pits, and we were in bubbles while we were racing and just only with our team. And you definitely feel the effects of that, and the effects of not having that same kind of community to lean on and feed off of. And so it's great to see that coming back. But yeah, you had to be so creative. And I think that more entrepreneurial people, or leadership that tends to be more entrepreneurial, can really kind of adapt quite quickly and pivot and, you know, just experiment. And I think you found that those companies, whether they were larger or smaller, tended to be more successful throughout it. And now we're just on this kind of weird kick where some things are going back to normal and some things are not. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how the dynamic of marketing and activation and engagement changes as, you know, maybe fewer people want to go out, maybe fewer people are going to either, you know, activate in person or, you know, taking meetings. And so I think there's still a whole lot of unknown, which is scary but exciting. And I think it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a really completely different question? Just occurred to me when you said racing was one of the first to come back. I was actually thinking that because Formula One came back so quick. What do you think of the fact, Julia, that Formula One does not have a women's anything? Because yeah, like, surely if they did, like, they must be one of the few. I was thinking, how many major leagues are there that doesn't have women's NFL doesn't.
Tour de France. Tour de France cycling.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think of the fact that Formula One doesn't?
Yeah, so I think racing in general, motorsports, are one of those more equalizers. Like, there are definitely biological differences between men and women. And if you look at Lewis Hamilton next to my build, his build's a little bigger. And, like, you know, there is that. So I think there are certain vehicles that could physically be harder for women to drive. I'm not saying they can't do it. I don't know if that plays into it. For the longest time with Formula One, you had Bernie Ecclestone, who was very vocal about not feeling that women belonged. And I think there was some quote about being barefoot in the kitchen or being like appliances. I think that's
my.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was fun.
My.
And so, you know, he led Formula One for a very long time. It was extremely successful in elevating the sport. So I think there's still a huge cultural issue. And I think, you know, again, the top levels of racing are exceptionally expensive. So you have that financial issue. And there are no women at the top of NASCAR right now. And so Danica was the only one of recent days to do that. And she had a huge corporate machine behind her from IndyCar. And I think that, you know, I think part of it's cultural. I think, you know, you would think that being different and having that unique ability to cater to half the population would be an asset. We've found that a lot of women struggle with sponsorship. Sponsorship is hard no matter what. Like, the levels of sponsorship dollars that drivers need and that teams need to go racing are huge. So it's hard anyway. But a lot of the people making the decisions are still older men, right? And so I think that there are kind of more nuanced variables to getting in. And you do see more teams that are having more women's initiatives. You have the W Series, which is very controversial. It's an all women's series, and they support the Formula One races, and it's supposed to be a feeder there. And you have a lot of mixed feelings about that, but they're not getting paid the many millions of dollars that Formula One drivers are. So I think it's frustrating, and I don't think that there is an easy fix to it, because you're not seeing it in Formula One, you're not seeing it in NASCAR, and you don't see it in IndyCar a lot either. So I don't think it's just because there's a physical difference. I think it's more nuanced. I think it's more business related, and you know, for some reason not seeing the potential or not wanting to take the risk. And I hope that, you know, you're seeing team owners get older and start preparing for the next generation. And I think we are going to see a shift. And it may or may not be in my racing career, unfortunately, but I think you are seeing a shift, and you see a lot more women at the grassroots level, but it takes many years to get to the top, right? So, but I'm optimistic by what I see.
Yeah.
Great question.
Yeah, that is. That is a great question.
That was a great question, because I would imagine Ishveen, and asking that question, and obviously you're making a more inclusive marketplace availability. So sponsorship, you would hope, could play a role in elevating female athletes in some way, because brands say, yes, you're right, it's half the population, and I want, you want someone speaking to you through sponsorship efforts and media platforms that will resonate with you, that's similar to you. And so it is surprising, but hopefully sponsorship, media, social media will help elevate, right, and provide that exposure for female athletes, and therefore hopefully funding into those sports that need female athletes. So
yeah, but I do think, interestingly, it's when I was thinking about it, I was thinking a women's only league, because I do think inevitably that's where it takes a lot of time, but you're seeing it now pay off in WNBA and the NWSL, even in like volleyball and stuff. I think women's leagues are needed, because ultimately when you think about grassroots, you need to have opportunities for like kids to, if it's going to be like one Danica, no parent is putting them, going through that. Whereas like, how does Formula One, like, okay, so there is something similar, but you think that Formula One would, the cost, I get the cost is high, but it doesn't make sense to me when anyone doesn't have like some sort of a women's counterpart, knowing that in 10 years time that will hugely pay off, but it is an investment.
Right.
It is, and it's probably, to a certain degree, it's where the eyeballs go in making that investment and when, right, and who does it first. And we have a tendency to be stuck in ruts as human beings, male or female, right? We just have a tendency to do what we've done because we've done it. And we talk about that in innovation all the time, right? So to break out of that, someone actually has to make the gutsy move of saying this is important, and I see a return on it, right? It can't be for the sake of the cause. The eyeballs have to show up now. Yeah. Right. And we know historically it's probably more men watching sports than women, but that's shifting just at the same rate. And on the other side of it, which is a really positive thing, to make more of the discretionary spending decisions, right? Which I think is the biggest thing, not just the population, but they're actually responsible for 80% of the purchases. So
well, that's what I was going to say, that I was just thinking it's particularly interesting with a car-based sport, that when women are making the car purchasing decisions and not as represented. Yeah. It's also interesting, again, because NASCAR has almost a 40% female fan base. So it's not like it's that skewed and like that much of but I think one thing that you will find, I think most women racers have a pretty strong divide as to whether they support the all-women series or they don't. And I think because so many racing series don't have that biological difference of just, a guy being able to hit a ball harder or run faster or whatever that is, because you don't have that divide as much. I think there's a lot of, a lot of us who feel like there's a certain pride that we can do it head to head and that we can. Right. And then, but then on the flip side, totally agree. If you don't see a lot of this representation, how are you going to inspire? It's like a chicken and egg problem. But then again, I think it's hard to ignore just, for anyone to go racing, you need to have, at this point, you need to have a family who can foot the bill for a while. Like that's just the reality of it. So a lot of times you also have where if they can only afford to have one kid go racing, more inclined to pick the boy. Yeah. Like, and that's just a cultural thing, kind of how you raise. So there's so many components to this that's daunting, but take the baby steps and keep working towards it.
Yeah, very true.
Progress. That's great.
I'd love to talk to both of you about, and this is a little granular in the weeds perhaps, but Julia, start with you. When you think about sponsorship opportunities, whether it's a specific brand, because again, we go back to the shared values, or the activations that they choose or ask of the athletes. But just love your thoughts on, are there any specific and those of interest, what was enjoyable, something that you said, oh, this really resonates with me as an individual. And yes, I'd be happy to do that on behalf of my sponsor, not just because I'm getting paid to do it, but because there's a general, yes, there's an interest there. Can you share a little bit?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, like we've been using the word sponsorship a lot. I've always viewed these as more of a partnership. Like there is traditional sponsorship where, you know, an athlete or team is sponsored to give exposure to this company. But I think the partnership is a little more well-rounded, and it, you know, some of the things that have been really cool are, I got to work with Disney and Shell. I mean, Disney separately, but Shell and now this media to kind of host a college competition for students who were engineers who were, you know, building alternative energy sources for these like little cars or go-karts, and, you know, went to England, went to this historic track, and, you know, they had this competition, and it was so cool to kind of tell these stories and to be the racer who was telling these stories with a STEM background and kind of seeing what they were doing from a technological side. So that's just super exciting. It's not sponsorship in a traditional sense, but it's you're putting out stories, you're, you know, being able to convey this information. And then I think the real fun for me comes in when you're willing to be that, take that creative route and to not just slap a logo on or do stuff. And I don't think you're seeing a lot of that when it comes to athletes as much anymore, and Ishveen can speak to that. But you know, that more hands-on, I enjoy that a lot, because I think there's a really organic way that it grows and you see what works. And with Disney, we were doing something around Cars 3 because they had their first female character. So it was me and a 12-year-old girl, and we got to share the stories and bring that awareness that what these kids were seeing on a cartoon is actually happening in real life as well. And I think that's really powerful, and just increasing that representation. So there's a lot of cool stuff to do, but I've always, and it's not the most efficient necessarily, but I've always really enjoyed that kind of face-to-face interaction. And I think that brings an added level of community. And maybe it's because I, you know, work from home and I'm by myself all the time and traveling races and everything, but it's super cool. In addition to just, you know, when you have a company that wants to work with you and not just like demand things, I think that always makes it a lot more creative and powerful.
Right, the connections made. And it sounds as though you probably have more creative latitude, or athletes in general now, than they used to, right? Hopefully.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure, because I feel like it's a you know, of the last 5 years for me, and I don't quite know what it was before. But yeah, it's you know, I can always give my input and they can always say no, but you have that ability to have the conversation.
That's great, Julia. Thank you. And Ishveen, and in that same vein, curious not only how, I mean, obviously with this marketplace, and you're using data to show ROI and making those real connections between a brand and an athlete. What have you seen in terms of the asks of athletes from brands that is different now than it used to be? That sort of plays off of Julia. Maybe you know, what was the history? What did it look like then, and what does it look like now?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I definitely back Julia's point, where I think most athletes who genuinely want to do a sponsorship deal prefer like the idea that they're giving, or that they're meeting, or that they're doing something in person, and it's more authentic. Although of course, what we're doing and seeing more of is the other side, the social, the digital, which I don't think is as personally fulfilling to the athlete. So I get that it's probably cheaper money, easier, and quicker. But I definitely have heard many times like, I prefer to do a speaking gig. But the problem is there's just not that as many of those as like, hey, I just want to do something on social. So yeah, we're definitely seeing a lot of social. COVID made that even more so. We had one of our brands, Sperry's, the shoe company, you know, they were basically using our athletes as content creators. They were like, we can't do photo shoots. We need content. Your guys are good. And we can pick up like surfers and skateboarders and NFL and NBA, just like give me people who shoot good content. So I'd say we're seeing a lot more of like this content play, the digital play, the being able to repurpose. I think that's so big. Like back in the day, if you did a sponsorship deal, you would have to go do like a whole TV shoot. Then you'd have to go and pay the TV channels to distribute. Now you can get the athlete to record something at home. They put it on their channel. You can put it on your paid channels. You put, you know, tens of thousands of dollars behind it, and suddenly millions of people have seen it. And that, like, so I think the age of Facebook and TikTok and all of these are just changing the game of like how much visibility you can get on these deals and how easy it is to get that. So that's obviously a lot of what we're seeing. So I think it's interesting though that the brands are probably looking happier with different kinds of deals than the athletes are happier with.
Right. No, that makes sense. So reach is certainly greater and probably more efficient and more organic media, less placed media, perhaps. Yeah. Probably a nice balance of both, but interesting to see that shift. Thank you both.
Yeah, I do want to circle back to the conversation we had before everyone showed up and before we started recording this, because we talked a little bit about the fact that this is race week, and I am so very curious about. For some reason, I imagine, because the only comparison I can have in my life is I like to bike a lot. And if I get a chance to get on a bike, I'll go. Someone says, we want to ride from here to there. And I'm like, yeah, I'll go wherever, anytime. And Julia, you said this is race week. So you're going to race in Atlanta tomorrow or
this weekend.
This weekend. Yeah. And I'm just curious, get everyone into that and what that is and what that looks like. And because it's just fascinating to me. I've gone deep on Formula One. I'm intrigued by all things speed.
Formula One is so great. Last week at Silverstone was spicy. Great race. So this is race week. This year, I'm racing a bunch on just some amateur series of Sports Car Club of America to stay sharp. My team from last year decided to sit this year out a little last minute. So working on that, but it's incredible because it's been a busy week. I was in Vegas yesterday, and it's weird because you have to be so focused on kind of the business development side. And then once I get to the track and you're just completely in the zone, right? And so we'll have all day practice tomorrow. And that's where it's interesting with racing, because practice is very different than other sports, because we don't practice the competitive part when we're practicing. We're just trying to make the car as quick as possible for a handful of laps at a time. Whereas racing, you're racing against people and you're trying to pass people and you're trying to defend and everything. So it's a different process. And then we'll have qualifying and race on Saturday and race on Sunday. And I just think it's very cool to be able to jump into a different series. It's super challenging for people who aren't familiar with racing. You know, there are so many different specifications of different types of cars, you know, different types of tires that you use, different horsepower. I was telling these guys that I was racing in a series, the Euro NASCAR series has about 450 horsepower, and this weekend I'll have 120. So it's just a very different style, and it's a lot of, you know, quick learning to figure out how to make it work. But it's very exciting, and it keeps me sharp, and it's fun to see kind of some of the people who are up and coming, some of the people who have been racing in this kind of series for so many years. I almost feel like in some ways, grassroots racing can be a little more competitive because it has so many people. It's a lower barrier to entry. So you have so many people that have been doing it for years, who know it inside and out, who have been to all of these racetracks. Whereas in a higher series, you just have fewer people who are competing. So it'll be interesting. I love that the world is opening up and that we're getting back to being able to travel around and have these chaotic schedules. I really thrive off of that. And but it's what I work towards every day.
That's so exciting. Will they allow fans at this particular, will there be fans in
that is a great question. I think there is going to be the allowance of fans there. They had them at the last race also. And I think most tracks like on the higher NASCAR circuit are opening up. It's still state dependent.
Sure.
But because it's all outside, I think that does help and make it a little bit easier. But yeah, the COVID situation is definitely tricky, and kind of circling back on our conversation about having to be adaptable. When we were racing last year, we had one of our races in the Czech Republic canceled very last minute because they had their COVID outbreak. So the whole series and all the competitors had to adapt and go to this new track in Croatia, learn it. And so I think all of us in general this year had a very aggressive crash course in how to go with the flow a little bit more, which I know I do not enjoy going with the flow. So I feel like it's a year of personal growth. And it's what you have to do. And yeah.
Self-awareness. That's good.
Yeah.
Very good. Self-awareness. And we haven't been able to talk about Survivor. I don't know if we'll get to that because that is fascinating.
Another conversation.
Another conversation for another day,
Part two.
perhaps.
Part two.
Yeah, part two on this. Ishveen, let's. One of the things that we're curious about is like people that you admire for what they've done in their life, what they've accomplished. Anyone in history, anyone even alive today, for what they've accomplished. People that you admire. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. There's, on a personal level, people I know, I would say there's a president of Verizon. I think she's one of the 3 presidents. She's the only female. And what I really like about her, I've been very fortunate to have met her quite a few times. And when you have this image of like corporate America and like rising to the top, you may think of like Cruella de Vil kind of persona, and she is just lovely and from the heart, and enjoys people and listening. And I think she really showed me that actually, you can be super successful, but by being a great person as well and caring about people. And I don't think that's shown enough. I think a lot of times you know, the personification of a strong leader is strength and one way, like smart and do this and do that. So I think that's huge for me. And then in terms of the athlete world, I'd probably say Serena Williams, for many different reasons. But I think for me, like the whole motherhood and playing through that period of her life is just so huge, that she kind of did that, and like a lot of people didn't know much about it, and it was all under wraps. And I just think that's like, I think she's shown that like literally you can do whatever you want and there are no boundaries. And I know a lot of people, like when they get pregnant, like you can't exercise, and I'm sure there's a lot of women who are like, well, Serena Williams played tennis, and so I can. So I think that's like pretty powerful.
Absolutely. I took a page out of Serena's. When I was 6 months pregnant, I was still running, because if Serena Williams can do it,
exactly.
That's a great story. Julia, do you have, I'd like to actually ask that same question to Julia, if you've got someone.
Yeah. So there are a lot living. Also a big Serena Williams fan, but one of my earliest heroes was Paul Newman. And for me, what was so cool about Paul Newman was that he did so much in his life. He was an actor and a race car driver and a philanthropist and a family man, and just like very classy. And I think from when I was a teenager and kind of learned more about him, it was like this idea where like, do not tell yourself no. Like you can go and pursue a lot of things that don't seem related, and you can have interests that vary from like maybe the one thing that you're really pursuing. And so to me, that's always been kind of a guiding light that like, you can keep trying. And I find that very inspirational, just in terms of how to live a life.
Yeah, Newman.
Oh, Newman.
Yeah, you don't really think about him as much anymore, but you're right. He was very eclectic in his life. I mean, just amazing, the number of things.
Salad dressing, race car.
Yeah,
Exactly.
spaghetti sauce. I mean, like really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Race car, those two things. That's a good model for you. Julia's, yeah, you can have, Julia's spaghetti sauce, Julia's, right? We got a future there.
There we go.
Talk to some sponsors. That's cool.
Here's another personal question we didn't talk about this in advance, so I'm kind of springing it on you, but I'm curious. So first, Ishveen, if there were any brand that you could work with or connect with an athlete, current or past, do you have one that comes to mind? I mean, it could be Verizon. We just heard your
trying to go out the box, maybe trying to be too cute. I don't know. I'd probably pick someone who wasn't doing sponsorship today so that they could experience it and taste it, because it's such a nice thing. And then I'd probably pick someone who just has like great a cause, and then do what we talked about, which is like getting athletes to like promote it. That would probably be my dream scenario, where both parties come away just feeling so great about the deal. Like we're working at the moment with the NHS in England, and we've done stuff with Texas government and Florida government to promote like vaccinations and COVID, and those are just so great deals, because you just feel like maybe you're doing a bit of good in the world as well, which, as a company, I'm always thinking about how can we make a difference, not just our athletes and our brands.
That's a great response to the altruistic. Yeah, yes, brand TBD, perhaps.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Julia, if you could choose a brand.
Yeah, my first choice that I've been working on, that I hope to continue working on, would be a feminine hygiene brand. I think that there's so much taboo, there's so much shame, and I think it's so unnecessary and not warranted by any means. And I just think it would be so cool to have a tampon car on the racetrack. I just think that would be amazing.
That's cool.
Yeah, we should talk.
I know, right? Yeah, the social would be amazing, and it's empowering, and I think it helps normalize something that is literally necessary to continue human life. So there's that, and then I also really get excited by STEM-oriented companies and technology-oriented companies that really empower the consumer or the user, the customer, whoever that is. So yeah, those are the two categories I'm particularly
great. Okay, see, a connection might just happen right here. You heard it.
Right. Could happen right here. And Kelly and I have a number of feminine-related products on our speaker series docket, don't we? I mean, we have
Ant Flow. We just had a speaker.
Yeah.
Flow,
that's right.
Brand. Yep. So similar.
That's true. Yeah. Let's see an Ant Flow car. That would be cool.
That's right.
There we go.
That's right. Aaron, any final questions or thoughts, or?
No, I think this
keep going for an hour, but
we could. I know we could go far beyond. No, I don't. This has been amazing. We've gone places that I didn't expect at all, and loved it all the way. Thank you for doing this. Do you have any other final thoughts or other perspectives you want to share with our audience that would be important for them, other than the fact that now that Kelly's told me and all of you have told me that you can start at any point in time in your life? I'm going to sign up for the Tour de
France
after this, just so you know. So
expect
me there. Yeah, it's probably going to be the senior version of it. But
do you think it's PC to say that, given you're the only male and we can't do Tour de France?
Ouch! Totally blew it there. It's not at all. Yeah. That's just sad that there's no. Yeah, they were talking about that on the Tour de France this year. Phil Lingle was talking about that, about the fact there's no female version of it.
That is amazing that they're talking about it, right? Like, I mean, I actually did not realize, I'm not a massive cycling viewer, but I did not realize, and the fact that they're even having the conversation is, I mean, that's you're as Julie said, baby steps. You're a few years away from.
Yeah.
Keith is right. Keith is actually correct. They did have a Tour de France Femme this year, and I can tell you in America, I come from the sport of professional cycling, and in most of the major North American races, the Amgen Tour of California, the USA Pro Challenge, there was a female tour that ran parallel paths with and sponsors were they were United Healthcare. There were some really large brands that, again, saw the value and said, there's a return here. It's not just causal and we need to support women. It was like, there is a return. Half of the population are making the decisions. So it is good to see, but it's great to hear a Phil Liggett, who is the voice of cycling and has been for a number of years in a international broadcast, to bring attention to it. And we need more of that, more influencers speaking about male and female. So to be moving in that
Kelly's friend Phil.
Yes,
it's really cool.
Thank you. With people as we leave, I think that something is so important, whether you're on the entrepreneurial path or the sports path or whatever it is, but especially those like underrepresented people in any industry. It's like, always ask. ask for the help, be very specific in the ask. Don't assume that people are going to tell you no, or don't assume that they're not going to respond. Let other people say that. Like, assume that you have every right to go ask the question, because you just never know who you might catch. And I think that especially women, we tend to assume that we're not going to get it, or kind of get in our own way, and just people in general can get in their own way. So don't be the one that tells yourself no. Like, always ask. There's usually very little potential risk of asking for help or assistance or questions or information.
That's great.
Yes. It's really good.
Universal.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
we asked both of you to participate in this, and you willingly did, which is always surprising to me that we have guests that are willing to show up and do this. So thank you again for your wonderful insights and conversation. And I would ask our audience to go out and follow and watch what they're doing as entrepreneurs and athletes, and see the great that they will create. Follow them in any social media you possibly can. And I look forward to seeing all your success in the future.
Yes. Ishveen, Julia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
It was great to talk to you,
Thank you.
Best of luck.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.